Welcome to a fireside reading of David Copperfield by Charles Dickens, Chapter 4, Part 2. Going down next morning rather earlier than usual, I paused outside the parlour door on hearing my mother's voice. She was very earnestly and humbly entreating Miss Murdstone's pardon, which that lady granted as a perfect reconciliation took place. I never knew my mother afterwards to give an opinion on any matter without first appealing to Miss Murdstone, or without having first ascertained by some sure means what Miss Murdstone's opinion was. And I never saw Miss Murdstone, when out of temper, she was infirm that way, move her hand towards her bag as if she were going to take out the keys and offer to resign them to my mother, without seeing that my mother was in a terrible fright. The gloomy taint that was in the Murdstone blood darkened the Murdstone religion, which was austere and wrathful. I have thought since that its assuming that character was a necessary consequence of Mr. Murdstone's firmness, which wouldn't allow him to let anybody off from the utmost weight of the severest penalties he could find any excuse for. Be this as it may, I well remember the tremendous visages with which we used to go to church, and the changed air of the place. Again the dreaded Sunday comes round, and I file into the old pew first, like a guarded captive brought to a condemned service. Again Miss Murdstone, in a black velvet gown that looks as if it had been made out of a pall, follows close upon me. Then my mother, then her husband. There is no Peggotty now, as in the old time. Again I listen to Miss Murdstone, mumbling the responses and emphasizing all the dread words with a cruel relish. Again I see her dark eyes roll round the church when she says, "Miserable sinners," as if she were calling all the congregation names. Again I catch rare glimpses of my mother moving her lips timidly between the two, with one of them muttering at each ear like low thunder. Again I wonder with a sudden fear whether it is likely that our good old clergyman can be wrong and Miss Murdstone right, and that all the angels in heaven can be destroying angels. Again, if I move a finger or relax a muscle of my face, Miss Murdstone pokes me with the prayer book and makes my side ache. Yes, and again, as we walk home, I note some neighbors looking at my mother and at me and whispering. Again, as the three go arm in arm and I linger behind alone, I follow some of those looks and wonder if my mother's step be really not so light as I have seen it, and if the gaiety of her beauty be really almost worried away. Again, I wonder whether any of the neighbors call to mind, as I do, how we used to walk home together, she and I. And I wonder stupidly about that, all the dreary, dismal day. There had been some talk on occasions of my going to boarding school. Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone had originated it, and my mother had of course agreed with them. Nothing, however, was concluded on the subject yet. In the meantime, I learnt lessons at home. I shall never forget those lessons. They were presided over nominally by my mother, but really by Mr. Murdstone and his sister, who were always present and found them a favourable occasion for giving my mother lessons in that miscalled firmness, which was the bane of both our lives. I believe I was kept at home for that purpose. I had been apt enough to learn and willing enough when my mother and I had lived alone together. I can faintly remember learning the alphabet at her knee. To this day, when I look upon the fat black letters in the primer, the puzzling novelty of their shapes, and the easy good nature of O and Q and S seem to present themselves again before me as they used to do. But they recall no feeling of disgust or reluctance. On the contrary, I seem to have walked along a path of flowers as far as the crocodile book, and to have been cheered by the gentleness of my mother's voice and manner all the way. But these solemn lessons which succeeded those, I remember as the death blow of my peace and a grievous daily drudgery and misery. They were very long, very numerous, very hard, perfectly unintelligible, some of them to me, and I was generally as much bewildered by them as I believe my poor mother was herself. Let me remember how it used to be, and bring one morning back. I came into the second best parlour after breakfast with my books and an exercise book and a slate. My mother is ready for me at her writing desk, but not half so ready as Mr. Murdstone in his easy chair by the window, though he pretends to be reading a book, or as Miss Murdstone sitting near my mother stringing steel beads. The very sight of these two has such an influence over me that I begin to feel the words I have been at infinite pains to get into my head all sliding away and going I don't know where. I wonder where they do go, by the by. I hand the first book to my mother. Perhaps it is a grammar, perhaps a history or geography. I take a last drowning look at the page as I give it to her and start off aloud at a racing pace while I've got it fresh. I trip over a word. Mr. Murdstone looks up. I trip over another word. Miss Murdstone looks up. I redden, tumble over half a dozen words, and stop. I think my mother would show me the book if she dared, but she does not dare, and she says softly, "Oh, Davy, Davy." "Now, Clara," says Mr. Murdstone, "be firm with the boy. Don't say, 'Oh, Davy, Davy.' That's childish. He knows his lesson, or he does not know it." "He does not know it," Miss Murdstone interposes awfully. "I am really afraid he does not," says my mother. "Then you see, Clara," returns Miss Murdstone, "you should just give him the book back and make him know it." "Yes, certainly," says my mother. "That is what I intend to do, my dear Jane. Now, Davy, try once more, and don't be stupid." I obey the first clause of the injunction by trying once more, but am not so successful with the second, for I am very stupid. I tumble down before I get to the old place at a point where I was all right before and stop to think, but I can't think about the lesson. I think of the number of yards of net in Miss Murdstone's cap, or of the price of Mr. Murdstone's dressing gown, or any such ridiculous problem that I have no business with and don't want to have anything at all to do with. Mr. Murdstone makes a movement of impatience, which I've been expecting for a long time. Miss Murdstone does the same. My mother glances submissively at them, shuts the book, and lays it by as an arrear to be worked out when my other tasks are done. There is a pile of these arrears very soon, and it swells like a rolling snowball. The bigger it gets, the more stupid I get. The case is so hopeless, and I feel that I am wallowing in such a bog of nonsense, that I give up all idea of getting out and abandon myself to my fate. The despairing way in which my mother and I look at each other as I blunder on is truly melancholy. But the greatest effect in these miserable lessons is when my mother, thinking nobody is observing me, tries to give me the cue by the motion of her lips. At that instant, Miss Murdstone, who has been lying in wait for nothing else all along, says in a deep, warning voice, "Clara!" My mother starts, colours, and smiles faintly. Mr. Murdstone comes out of his chair, takes the book, throws it at me, or boxes my ears with it, and turns me out of the room by the shoulders. Even when the lessons are done, the worst is yet to happen in the shape of an appalling sum. This is invented for me and delivered to me orally by Mr. Murdstone, and begins, "If I go into a cheesemonger's shop and buy 5,000 double Gloucester cheeses at 4 halfpenny each, present payment." At which I see Miss Murdstone secretly overjoyed. I pore over these cheeses without any result or enlightenment until dinner time, when, having made a mulatto of myself by getting the dirt of the slate into the pores of my skin, I have a slice of bread to help me out with the cheeses, and am considered in disgrace for the rest of the evening. It seems to me, at this distance of time, as if my unfortunate studies generally took this course. I could have done very well if I'd been without the Murdstones, that the influence of the Murdstones upon me was like the fascination of two snakes on a wretched young bird. Even when I did get through the morning with tolerable credit, there was not much gained but dinner, for Miss Murdstone never could endure to see me untasked, and if I rashly made any show of being unemployed, called her brother's attention to me by saying, "Clara, my dear, there's nothing like work. Give your boy an exercise," which caused me to be clapped down to some new labour there and then. As to any recreation with other children of my age, I had very little of that, for the gloomy theology of the Murdstones made all children out to be a swarm of little vipers, though there was a child once set in the midst of the disciples, and held that they contaminated one another. The natural result of this treatment continued, I suppose, for 6 months or more, was to make me sullen, dull, and dogged. I was not made the less so by my sense of being daily more and more shut out and alienated from my mother. I believe I should have been almost stupefied, but for one circumstance. It was this. My father had left a small collection of books in a little room upstairs to which I had access, for it adjoined my own, and which nobody else in our house ever troubled. From that blessed little room, Roderick Random, Peregrine Pickle, Humphrey Clinker, Tom Jones, the Vicar of Wakefield, Don Quixote, Gil Blas, and Robinson Crusoe came out, a glorious host, to keep me company. They kept alive my fancy and my hope of something beyond that place and time. They and the Arabian Nights and the tales of the genii, and did me no harm, for whatever harm was in some of them was not there for me. I knew nothing of it. It is astonishing to me now how I found time, in the midst of my porings and blunderings over heavier themes, to read those books as I did. It is curious to me how I could ever have consoled myself under my small troubles, which were great troubles to me, by impersonating my favorite characters in them as I did, and by putting Mr. and Mrs. Murdstone into all the bad ones, which I did too. I have been Tom Jones, a child's Tom Jones, a harmless creature, for a week together. I have sustained my own idea of Roderick Random for a month at a stretch, I verily believe. I had a greedy relish for a few volumes of voyages and travels, I forget what now, that were on those shelves, and for days and days I can remember to have gone about my region of our house, armed with the centerpiece out of an old set of boot trees, the perfect realization of Captain Somebody of the Royal British Navy, in danger of being beset by savages and resolved to sell his life at a great price. The captain never lost dignity from having his ears boxed with the Latin grammar. I did, but the captain was a captain and a hero, in despite of all the grammars of all the languages in the world, dead or alive. This was my only and my constant comfort when I think of it. The picture always rises in my mind of a summer's evening, the boys at play in the churchyard, and I sitting on my bed, reading as if for life. Every barn in the neighborhood, every stone in the church, and every foot of the churchyard had some association of its own in my mind connected with these books, and stood for some locality made famous in them. I have seen Tom Pipes go climbing up the church steeple. I have watched Strap with the knapsack on his back, stopping to rest himself upon the wicket gate. And I know that Commodore Trunnion held that club with Mr. Pickle in the parlour of our little village alehouse. The reader now understands, as well as I do, what I was when I came to that point of my youthful history, to which I am now coming again. One morning, when I went into the parlour with my books, I found my mother looking anxious, Miss Murdstone looking firm, and Mr. Murdstone binding something round the bottom of a cane, a lithe and limber cane which he left off binding when I came in and poised and switched in the air. "I tell you, Clara," said Mr. Murdstone, "I have been often flogged myself." "To be sure, of course," said Miss Murdstone. "Certainly, my dear Jane," faltered my mother meekly, "but do you think it did Edward good?" "Do you think it did Edward harm, Clara?" asked Mr. Murdstone gravely. "That's the point," said his sister. To this my mother returned, "Certainly, my dear Jane," and said no more. I felt apprehensive that I was personally interested in this dialogue, and sought Mr. Murdstone's eye as it lighted on me. "Now, David," he said, and I saw that cast again as he said it, "you must be far more careful today than usual." He gave the cane another poise and another switch, and having finished his preparation of it, laid it down beside him with an impressive look and took up his book. This was a good freshener to my presence of mind as a beginning. I felt the words of my lessons slipping off, not one by one or line by line, but by the entire page. I tried to lay hold of them, but they seemed, if I may so express it, to have put skates on and to skim away from me with a smoothness there was no checking. We began badly and went on worse. I had come in with an idea of distinguishing myself, rather, conceiving that I was very well prepared, but it turned out to be quite a mistake. Book after book was added to the heap of failures, Miss Murdstone being firmly watchful of us all the time. And when we came at last to the 5,000 cheeses, canes he made it that day, I remember. My mother burst out crying. "Clara," said Miss Murdstone in her warning voice. "I am not quite well, my dear Jane, I think," said my mother. I saw him wink solemnly at his sister as he rose and said, taking up the cane, "Why, Jane, we can hardly expect Clara to bear with perfect firmness the worry and torment that David has occasioned her today. That would be stoical. Clara is greatly strengthened and improved, but we can hardly expect so much from her. David, you and I will go upstairs. Boy." As he took me out at the door, my mother ran towards us. Miss Murdstone said, "Clara, are you a perfect fool?" and interfered. I saw my mother stop her ears then, and I heard her crying. He walked me up to my room slowly and gravely. I am certain he had a delight in that formal parade of executing justice, and when we got there, suddenly twisted my head under his arm. "Mr. Murdstone, sir," I cried to him, pray don't beat me. I have tried to learn, sir, but I can't learn while you and Miss Murdstone are by. I can't indeed." "Can't you indeed, David?" he said. "We'll try that." He had my head as in a vice, but I twined round him somehow and stopped him for a moment, entreating him not to beat me. It was only a moment that I stopped him, for he cut me heavily an instant afterwards, and in the same instant I caught the hand with which he held me in my mouth between my teeth, and I bit through it. It sets my teeth on edge to think of it. He beat me then as if he would have beaten me to death. Above all the noise we made, I heard them running up the stairs and crying out. I heard my mother crying out and Peggotty. Then he was gone, and the door was locked outside, and I was lying fevered and hot and torn and sore and raging in my puny way upon the floor. How well I recollect, when I became quiet, what an unnatural stillness seemed to reign through the whole house. How well I remember, when my smart and passion began to cool, how wicked I began to feel. I sat listening for a long while, but there was not a sound. I crawled up from the floor and saw my face in the glass, so swollen, red, and ugly that it almost frightened me. My stripes were sore and stiff, and made me cry afresh when I moved. But they were nothing to the guilt I felt. It lay heavier on my breast than if I'd been a most atrocious criminal, I dare say. It had begun to grow dark, and I had shut the window. I'd been lying for the most part with my head upon the sill, by turns crying, dozing, and looking listlessly out, when the key was turned and Miss Murdstone came in with some bread and meat and milk. These she put down upon the table without a word, glaring at me the while with exemplary firmness, and then retired, locking the door after her. Long after it was dark, I sat there, wondering whether anybody else would come. When this appeared improbable for that night, I undressed and went to bed. And there I began to wonder fearfully what would be done to me, whether it was a criminal act that I had committed, whether I should be taken into custody and sent to prison, whether I was at all in danger of being hanged. I never shall forget the waking next morning, the being cheerful and fresh for the first moment, and then the being weighted down by the stale and dismal oppression of remembrance. Miss Murdstone reappeared before I was out of bed, told me in so many words that I was free to walk in the garden for half an hour and no longer, and retired, leaving the door open that I might avail myself of that permission. I did so, and did so every morning of my imprisonment, which lasted 5 days. If I could have seen my mother alone, I should have gone down on my knees to her and besought her forgiveness. But I saw no one, Miss Murdstone excepted, during the whole time, except at evening prayers in the parlour, to which I was escorted by Miss Murdstone after everybody else was placed, where I was stationed, a young outlaw, all alone by myself at the door, and whence I was solemnly conducted by my jailor before any one arose from the devotional posture. I only observed that my mother was as far off from me as she could be, and kept her face another way so that I never saw it, and that Mr. Murdstone's hand was bound up in a large linen wrapper. The length of those 5 days I can convey no idea of to anyone. They occupy the place of years in my remembrance. The way in which I listened to all the incidents of the house that made themselves audible to me, the ringing of bells, the opening and shutting of doors, the murmuring of voices, the footsteps on the stairs, to any laughing, whistling, or singing outside, which seemed more dismal than anything else to me in my solitude and disgrace, the uncertain pace of the hours, especially at night, when I would wake thinking it was morning and find that the family were not yet gone to bed, and that all the length of night had yet to come, the depressed dreams and nightmares I had, the return of day, noon, afternoon, evening, when the boys played in the churchyard, and I watched them from a distance within the room, being ashamed to show myself at the window, lest they should know I was a prisoner. The strange sensation of never hearing myself speak, the fleeting intervals of something like cheerfulness, which came with eating and drinking and went away with it, the setting in of rain one evening with a fresh smell, and its coming down faster and faster between me and the church, until it and gathering night seemed to quench me in gloom and fear and remorse. All this appears to have gone round and round for years instead of days. It is so vividly and strongly stamped on my remembrance. On the last night of my restraint, I was awakened by hearing my own name spoken in a whisper. I started up in bed, and putting out my arms in the dark, said, "Is that you, Peggotty?" There was no immediate answer, but presently I heard my name again in a tone so very mysterious and awful that I think I should have gone into a fit if it had not occurred to me that it must have come through the keyhole. I groped my way to the door, and putting my own lips to the keyhole, whispered, "Is that you, Peggotty, dear?" "Yes, my own precious Davy," she replied. "Be as soft as a mouse, or the cat will hear us." I understood this to mean Miss Murdstone, and was sensible of the urgency of the case, her room being close by. "How's Mamma, dear Peggotty? Is she very angry with me?" I could hear Peggotty crying softly on her side of the keyhole as I was doing on mine, before she answered, "No, not very." "What is going to be done with me, Peggotty dear, do you know?"
School. Near London, was Peggotty's answer.
I was obliged to get her to repeat it, for she spoke it the first time quite down my throat in consequence of my having forgotten to take my mouth away from the keyhole and put my ear there, and though her words tickled me a good deal, I didn't hear them.
When, Peggotty? Tomorrow.
Is that the reason why Miss Murdstone took the clothes out of my drawers? Which she had done, though I have forgotten to mention it.
Yes,
said Peggotty.
Box.
Shan't I see Mamma?
Yes,
said Peggotty.
Morning.
Then Peggotty fitted her mouth close to the keyhole and delivered these words through it with as much feeling and earnestness as a keyhole has ever been the medium of communicating, I will venture to assert, shooting in each broken little sentence in a convulsive little burst of its own.
Davy, dear, if I ain't been exactly as intimate with you lately as I used to be, it ain't because I don't love you. Just as well and more, my pretty puppet. It's because I thought it better for you. And for someone else besides. Davy, my darling, are you listening? Can you hear?
Yes, Peggotty,
I sobbed. My own,
said Peggotty with infinite compassion.
What I want to say is that you must never forget me, for I'll never forget you, and I'll take as much care of your mamma, Davy, as ever I took of you, and I won't leave her. The day may come when she'll be glad to lay her poor head on her stupid cross old Peggotty's arm again. And I'll write to you, my dear, though I ain't no scholar. And I'll...
Peggotty fell to kissing the keyhole, as she couldn't kiss me.
Thank you, dear Peggotty,
said I.
Oh, thank you. Will you promise me one thing, Peggotty? Will you write and tell Mr. Peggotty and little Emily and Mrs. Gummidge and Ham that I'm not so bad as they might suppose, and that I send them all my love, especially to little Emily? Will you, if you please, Peggotty?
The kind soul promised, and we both of us kissed the keyhole with the greatest affection. I parted it with my hand, I recollect, as if it had been her honest face, and parted. From that night there grew up in my breast a feeling for Peggotty which I cannot very well define. She did not replace my mother. No one could do that, but she came into a vacancy in my heart which closed upon her, and I felt towards her something I have never felt for any other human being. It was a sort of comical affection, too. And yet if she had died, I cannot think what I should have done, or how I should have acted out the tragedy it would have been to me. In the morning, Miss Murdstone appeared as usual and told me I was going to school, which was not altogether such news to me as she supposed. She also informed me that when I was dressed, I was to come downstairs into the parlour and have my breakfast. There I found my mother, very pale and with red eyes, into whose arms I ran and begged her pardon from my suffering soul.
"Oh, Davy," she said, "that you could hurt anyone I love. Try to be better. Pray to be better. I forgive you, but I am so grieved, Davy, that you should have such bad passions in your heart.
They had persuaded her that I was a wicked fellow, and she was more sorry for that than for my going away. I felt it sorely. I tried to eat my parting breakfast, but my tears dropped upon my bread and butter and trickled into my tea. I saw my mother look at me sometimes, and then glance at the watchful Miss Murdstone, and then look down or look away. "Master Copperfield's box there," said Miss Murdstone, when wheels were heard at the gate. I looked for Peggotty, but it was not she. Neither she nor Mr. Murdstone appeared. My former acquaintance, the carrier, was at the door. The box was taken out to his cart and lifted in. "Clara," said Miss Murdstone in her warning note.
"Ready, my dear Jane?"
returned my mother.
"Goodbye, Davy. You are going for your own good. Goodbye, my child. You will come home in the holidays and be a better boy."
"Clara," Miss Murdstone repeated.
"Certainly, my dear Jane,"
replied my mother, who was holding me.
"I forgive you, my dear boy. God bless you."
"Clara," Miss Murdstone repeated. Miss Murdstone was good enough to take me out to the cart and to say on the way that she hoped I would repent before I came to a bad end. And then I got into the cart, and the lazy horse walked off with it. Thank you for joining me. We will continue with the next chapter tomorrow, same time and place, 5 Pacific at Fireside Reading on Instagram. And all the chapters and a brief synopsis are uploaded to the YouTube channel, Fireside Reading, pretty quickly. Until I see you again, please stay very well. Good night.